Hello again, Dan Alasso here, Making History, and today I am going to begin reading primary sources for U.S. history. I have several volumes of these, and I'm going to use some of these readings with my students this fall in U.S. History 1. And I thought that other people out there might be interested in this as well. So I'm going to read from these books. This is a collection. It's called American History Told by Contemporaries. And this is Volume 1, The Era of Colonization, 1492 to 1689. But actually, this early section of it, Part 2, Discovery and Early Voyages, actually is dated 1000 to 1600. And this chapter, which is Chapter 3, Norse and Spanish Discoveries, begins with Norse discoveries of Greenland and Wineland the Good about 1000. And it is attributed to Hauk Erlendsson about 1300, translated by A.M. Reeves in 1890 and published in London, I believe. And it begins like this. It says, "These sagas were accounts composed at the time and handed down by oral tradition for about 3 centuries, when the version used below was written down in Icelandic by Erlendsson, a Norwegian knight and lawman of Icelandic birth. The narrative is trustworthy, but does not go into details enough to identify the places mentioned." Now, these were all written, of course, in a period when this was just legend, and a lot of people didn't really believe that Norsemen had been to the Americas at all, and believed that it was just a sort of a patriotic national myth of Norwegian-speaking people. And of course, later it was found that there was a colony on the northern tip of Newfoundland. And so now we've changed the way that we understand that. It wasn't a permanent colony, but it looks like many of the things that are talked about in here are true. And so this is the primary source document, supposedly written about 1300 and published in 1890 in England. And it goes like this. Eric the Red finds Greenland. There was a man named Thorvald. He was the son of Osvald, Ulf's son, Exna Thori's son. His son's name was Eric. He and his father went from Geirinn to Iceland on account of manslaughter and settled on Hornstrandir and dwelt at Drangar. Eric and his people were condemned to outlawry at Thorsnesthing. He equipped his ship for a voyage in Eriksvag, where Eyjolf concealed him in Dimrarvag, and when Thorgest and his people were searching for him among the islands. He said to them that it was his intention to go in search of that land which Gunnbjorn, the son of Ulf the Crow, saw when he was driven out of his course westward across the main and discovered Gunnbjorn's skerries. He told them that he would return again to his friends if he should succeed in finding that country. Thorbjorn and Eyjolf and Styr accompanied Eric out beyond the islands, and they parted with the greatest friendliness. Eric said to them that he would render them similar aid, so far as it might be within his power, if they should ever stand in need of his help. Eric sailed out to sea from Snæfellsjökull and arrived at that ice mountain which is called Blacksark. Thence he sailed to the southward, that he might ascertain whether there was habitable country in that direction. He passed the first winter at Eriksay near the middle of the western settlement. In the following spring, he proceeded to Eriksfirth and selected a site for his homestead. That summer, he explored the western uninhabited region, remaining there for a long time and assigned many local names there. The second winter, he spent at Eriksholms beyond Hvarsknipa, but the third summer he sailed northward to Snæfell and into Hrafnsfirth. He believed then that he had reached the land of Eriksfirth. The following summer he sailed to Iceland and landed in Breiðafirth. He remained that winter with Ingolf at Holmlatr In the spring, he and Thorgest fought together, and Eric was defeated. After this, a reconciliation was effected between them. That summer, Eric set out to colonize the land which he had discovered, and which he called Greenland, because, he said, men would be the more readily persuaded thither if the land had a good name. Concerning Leif the Lucky and the introduction of Christianity into Greenland. Eric was married to a woman named Thorhild and had 2 sons. One of these was named Thorstein and the other Leif. They were both promising men. Thorstein lived at home with his father, and there was not at that time a man in Greenland who was accounted of so much promise as he. Leif had sailed to Norway, where he was at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason. He was well received by the king, who felt that he could see that Leif was a man of great accomplishments. Upon one occasion, the king came to a speech with Leif and asks him, "Is it thy purpose to sail to Greenland this summer?" "It is my purpose," said Leif, "if it be your will." "I believe it will be well," answers the king, "and thither you shalt go upon my errand, to proclaim Christianity there." Leif replied that the king should decide, but gave it as his belief that it would be difficult to carry this mission to a successful issue in Greenland. The king replied that he knew of no man who would be better fitted for this undertaking, and in thy hands the cause will surely prosper. "This can only be," said Leif, "if I enjoy the grace of your protection." Leif put to sea when his ship was ready for the voyage. For a long time he was tossed about upon the ocean and came upon lands of which he had previously had no knowledge. There were self-sown wheat fields and vines growing there. There were also those trees there which are called mausur, and of all these they took specimens. Some of the timbers were so large that they were used in building. Leif found men upon a wreck and took them home with him, and procured quarters for them during all the winter. In this wise he showed his nobleness and goodness, since he introduced Christianity into the country and saved the men from the wreck. He was called Leif the Lucky ever after. Leif landed in Eriksfjord and then went home to Brattahlid. He was well received by everyone. He soon proclaimed Christianity throughout the land and the Catholic faith, and announced King Olaf Tryggvason's messages to the people, telling them how much excellence and how great glory accompanied this faith. Next section is called Beginning of the Wineland Voyages. About this time, there began to be much talk at Brattahlid to the effect that Wineland the Good should be explored. For, it was said, that country must be possessed of many goodly qualities. And so it came to pass that Karl, Cephny, and Snorri fitted out their ship for the purpose of going in search of that country in the spring. Bjarni and Thorhall joined the expedition with their ship. Thorhall was stout and swarthy and of great stature. He was a man of few words, though given to abusive language when he did speak, and he ever incited Eric to evil. He was a poor Christian. He had a wide knowledge of the unsettled regions. He was on the same ship with Thorvard and Thorvald. They had that ship which Thorbjorn had brought out. They had in all 160 men when they sailed to the western settlement, and thence to Bear Island. Thence they bore away to the southward, to Duger. Don't know what that means. Then they saw land, and launched a boat, and explored the land, and found there large flat stones, heller, and many of these were 12 ells wide. There were many Arctic foxes there. They gave a name to the country, called it Helleland, the land of flat stones. Then they sailed with northerly winds to Duger, and land then lay before them, and upon it was a great wood and many wild beasts. An island lay off the land to the southeast, and there they found a bear, and they called this Bjarni, Bear Island, while the land where the wood was they called Markland, Forest Land. Thence they sailed southward along the land for a long time and came to a cape, and the land lay upon the starboard. There were long strands and sandy banks there. They rowed to the land and found upon the cape there the keel of a ship, and they called it there Keelness. They also called the strands Furdustrander, wonder strands, because they were so long to sail by. Then the country became indented with bays, and they steered their ships into a bay. Now when they had sailed past Wonderlands, they put the Gales ashore and directed them to run to the southward and investigate the nature of the country and return again before the end of the third half day. They were each clad in a garment which they called kaiful, and they were so fashioned that it had a hood at the top, was open at the sides, was sleeveless, and was fastened with buttons and loops, while elsewhere they were naked. Karl, Cephny, and his companions cast anchor and lay there during their absence, and when they came again, one of them carried a bunch of grapes, and the other an ear of new-sown wheat. They went on board the ship, whereupon Karl, Cephny, and his followers held on their way until they came to where the coast was indented with bays. They stood into a bay with their ships. There was an island out at the north of the bay, about which there were strong currents, wherefore they called it Straume, Stream Island. There were so many birds there that it was scarcely possible to step between the eggs. They sailed through the firth and called it Straumfjord, Streamfirth, and carried their cargoes ashore from the ships and established themselves there. There were mountains thereabouts. They occupied themselves exclusively with the exploration of the country. They remained there during the winter, and they had taken no thought for this during the summer. The fishing began to fail, and they began to fall short of food. The weather then improved, and they could now row out to fish, and thenceforth they had no lack of provisions, for they could hunt game on the land, gather eggs on the island, and catch fish from the sea. Concerning Karlsefni and Thorhall. It is said that Thorhall wished to sail to the northward, beyond Wonderstrands, in search of Wineland, while Karlsefni desired to proceed to the southward, off the coast. It is now to be told of Karlsefni that he cruised southward off the coast with Snorri and Bjarni and their people. They sailed for a long time until they came at last to a river which flowed down from the land into a lake and so into the sea. There were great bars at the mouth of the river so that it could only be entered at the height of the flood tide. Karlsefni and his men sailed into the mouth of the river and called it the Hope, a small landlocked bay. They found self-sown wheat fields on the land there. Wherever there were hollows and wherever there was hilly ground, there were vines. Every brook there was full of fish. They dug pits on the shore where the tide rose highest, and when the tide fell, there were halibut in the pits. There were great numbers of wild animals of all kinds in the woods. They remained there half a month and enjoyed themselves and kept no watch. They had their livestock with them. Now one morning, early, when they looked about them, they saw a great number of skin canoes, and staves were brandished from the boats, with a noise like flails, and they were revolved in the same direction in which the sun moves. Then said Karlsefni, "What may this betoken?" Snorri, Thorbrand's son, answers him, "It may be that this is a good signal of peace. Wherefore let us take a white shield and display it." And thus they did. Thereupon the strangers rowed toward them and went upon the land, marveling at those whom they saw before them. They were swarthy men and ill-looking, and the hair on their heads was ugly. They had great eyes and were broad in the cheek. They tarried there for a long time, looking curiously at the people they saw before them, and then rowed away, and to the southward around the point. Karlsefni and his followers had built their huts above the lake, some of their dwellings being near the lake and others farther away. Now they remained there that winter. No snow came there, but all of their livestock lived by grazing. And when spring opened, they discovered early one morning a great number of skin canoes rowing up from the south past the cape, so numerous that it looked as if coals had been scattered broadcast out before the bay. And on every boat staves were waved. Thereupon Cephny and his people displayed their shields, and when they came together, they began to barter with each other. Especially did the strangers wish to buy red cloth, for which they offered in exchange peltries and quite grey skins. They also desired to buy swords and spears, but Cephny and Snorri forbade this. In exchange for perfect unsullied skins, the Skrellings would take red stuff, a span in length, which they would bind around their heads. So their trade went on for a time until Cephny and his people began to grow short of cloth, when they divided it into such narrow pieces that it was no more than a finger's breadth wide. But the Skrellings still continued to give them just as much for this as before, or more. So it happened that a bull, which belonged to Cephny and his people, ran out into the woods, bellowing loudly. This so terrified the Skrellings that they sped out to their canoes and then rowed away to the southward along the coast. Now I just want to take a minute here to call attention to the fact these Norsemen had brought cattle with them on their ships to this new land. So it does seem like they are prepared for a longish stay, if not for making a permanent settlement there. For 3 entire weeks, nothing more was seen of them. At the end of this time, however, a great multitude of Skrelling boats was discovered approaching from the south, as if a stream were pouring down, and all of the staves were waved in a direction contrary to the course of the sun, and the Skrellings were all uttering loud cries. And I should mention, since I keep using this word, that Skrelling or Skraeling apparently in the Old Norse language means something like screamers, because apparently these people scream very loudly when they go into battle, which we may be about to see right now. Thereupon, Cephny and his men took red shields and displayed them. The Skrellings sprang from their boats, and they met them and fought together. There was a fierce shower of missiles, for the Skrellings had war slings. Cephny and Snorri observed that the Skrellings raised upon a pole a great ball-shaped body, almost the size of a sheep's belly, nearly black in color. And this they hurled from the pole up on the land above Cephny's followers, and it made a frightful noise where it fell. Whereupon a great fear seized upon Cephny and all his men, so that they could think of naught but flight, and making their escape up along the riverbank, for it seemed to them that the troop of Skrellings was rushing towards them from every side, and they did not pause until they came to certain jutting crags, where they offered a stout resistance. Freydis came out, and seeing that Cephny and his men were fleeing, she cried, "Why do you flee from these wretches, such worthy men as ye, when, meseems, ye might slaughter them like cattle? Had I but a weapon, methinks, I would fight better than any of you." And so I'll also point out here that apparently there are women in this Norse settlement. They gave no heed to her words. Freydis sought to join them, but lagged behind, for she was not hale. She followed them, however, into the forest, where the Skrellings pursued her. She found a dead man in front of her. This was Thorbrand, Snorri's son, his skull cleft by a flat stone. His naked sword lay beside him. She took it up and prepared to defend herself with it. The Skrellings then approached her, whereupon she slapped her breast with the naked weapon. At this, the Skrellings were terrified and ran down to their boats and rowed away. Cephny and his companions, however, joined her and praised her valor. 2 of Cephny's men had fallen, and a great number of the Skrellings. Cephny's party had been overpowered by dint of superior numbers. They now returned to their dwellings and bound up their wounds, and weighed carefully what throng of men that could have been, which had seemed to descend upon them from the land. And it now seemed to them that there could have been but one party, that which came from the boats, and that the other troop must have been an ocular delusion. The Skrellings, moreover, found a dead man, and an axe lay beside him. One of their number picked up the axe and struck at a tree with it. And one after another, they tested it, and it seemed to them to be a treasure, and to cut well. Then one of their number seized it and hewed at a stone with it, so that the axe broke, whereat they concluded that it could be of no use, since it would not withstand stone, and they cast it away. It now seemed clear to Karl Cephny and his people that although the country thereabouts was attractive, their life would be one of constant dread and turmoil by reason of the hostility of the inhabitants of the country. So they forthwith prepared to leave, and determined to return to their own country. They sailed to the northward off the coast, and found 5 Skrellings clad in skin doublets, lying asleep near the sea. There were vessels beside them, containing animal marrow mixed with blood. Karl Cephny and his company concluded that they must have been banished from their own land. They put them to death. They afterwards found a cape upon which was a great number of animals, which lay there that night. They now arrived again at Streamfirth, where they found great abundance of all of those things of which they stood in need. Some say that Bjarni and Freydis remained behind here with 100 men and went no further, while Karl Cephny and Snorri proceeded to the southward with 40 men, tarrying at Hope barely 2 months and returning again the same summer. Karl Cephny then set out with 1 ship in search of Thorhall the huntsman, but the greater part of the company remained behind. They sailed to the northward around Keelness, and then bore to the westward, having land to the larboard. The country there was a wooded wilderness, as far as they could see, with scarcely an open space, and when they had journeyed a considerable distance, a river flowed down from the east toward the west. They sailed into the mouth of the river, and lay to by the southern bank. And that's the end of this passage. And again, this is credited to the saga of Eric the Red in Arthur Middleton Reeves' The Finding of Wineland the Good, published in London in 1890. So that was an interesting depiction of how the Norsemen came apparently with cattle and with women, which does seem much more like a permanent settlement than it does a temporary exploratory mission or fishing camp. When the little village at L'Anse-aux-Meadows was found in northern Newfoundland, there were 8 or 9 buildings. There was a blacksmith shop. There was a spinning room that had the remains of a loom and had spindles and paraphernalia for making yarn and cloth. So this does seem a lot like a settlement. And there are some further legends about how when they weren't fighting the Skrellings, they traded with them. And one of the things that the Skrellings apparently wanted very much from the Norsemen, in addition to this red cloth, was milk, which of course they would never have seen before because cattle were not indigenous to the Americas. Also, another thing that I found very interesting that I wasn't aware of was this place that they called Keelness, where they found the keel of apparently a previous shipwreck. So this North Atlantic region does seem to have been a place where Norsemen or Vikings, people from Norway and then from Iceland and from Greenland, did occasionally sail into, sometimes probably accidentally by way of being pushed by storms in the North Atlantic. But that this is an area about which there seems to be some knowledge before Leif Erikson's people first go there. So in any case, I thought this was very interesting. I do think it's kind of fun to push the European interaction with the Americas back by a full half a millennium, because I think that also calls into question how much cultural memory there was of that 500 years later, when it was time for Italian navigators to begin going out in search of new worlds. So in any case, I hope you found that a little bit interesting. I'll continue reading primary source passages from this book and then from the 3 additional volumes that follow it. But that's all for now. So thanks very much for listening. I'll see you again